and no one knew what it was all about.
Scientists at the National Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta today released the results of a study which shows that the lifestyle of some male homosexuals has triggered an epidemic of a rare form of cancer.
1 2-year period, I gave 90 eulogies of young men under 40, all in great shape, dead within 2 to 4 weeks.
No one knew about AIDS at that point. And then a friend of mine by the name of Larry Kramer came to me one day and said, there's something going on in the gay community and you're not reporting on it. There's a disease. It's a communicable disease.
It was like we were at wartime on the battlefield and everybody else was at peacetime. You didn't know if you were going to see your best friend tomorrow. You just didn't know.
Here again is Tom Brokaw in New York.
Good evening. AIDS is terrifying, yet fear can be more contagious than the disease itself.
We decided to do the first documentary done on AIDS. There had not been a lot of coverage at that point.
I would like to know if you can contact AIDS by kissing, touching, or just being around someone that has the disease.
People resisted the idea of AIDS. They thought that it didn't have application to their lives. And then Ryan White comes along and gives it a new face. This young man who had contracted AIDS, treated as a pariah by young people and people not quite knowing how to deal with him.
Some kids, you know, if I walk by them in the hall, they flatten themselves up against the locker.
AIDS has claimed more than 140,000 American lives in the past decade. That's almost 3 times the number killed in Vietnam.
A lot of people, even in our business, wouldn't take it seriously because it was over there in that culture. And then the equation was changed.
Good evening. The news is so shocking and so unexpected, it is difficult to absorb it even as we report it. Magic Johnson has tested positive for the HIV virus.
I think sometimes we think, well, only gay people can get it, well, it's not going to happen to me. And here I am saying that it can happen to anybody.
AIDS had been a tragedy before Magic Johnson got it. But when Magic Johnson, who was this virile professional athlete and a beloved figure in American life, talked about AIDS, you could just sense the awareness going up dramatically overnight.
We now have treatments that consist of a couple of pills a day that are able to suppress the virus in the vast majority of patients. The battleground today is not so much anymore in the United States, it's really in the poor countries of the world. We estimate that at least 40 million people worldwide are infected.
AIDS is a pandemic. It can destabilize countries. It can have an enormous effect on our future. It's not just that we have a moral responsibility, we have a big stake in this, politically and financially and otherwise.
We have main engine start, 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
When the Challenger went up, I was in the White House with Peter Jennings, getting a briefing on that night's State of the Union speech by the President, Ronald Reagan.
Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%.
And Don Regan, who was the White House Chief of Staff, briefing us, and he said, oh, something wrong with the Challenger. It's exploded on the pad. We'll get back to you if there's any more about this. And he went on, started on with the briefing, and Peter and I were knocking over furniture, trying to get out.
The Challenger, with a school teacher and 6 regular astronauts on board, was consumed by a giant fireball explosion less than 2 minutes after it was launched into the bright blue Florida skies at 11:38 Eastern Time this morning.
9 nautical miles, downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
As soon as I took a look at that television set and saw those 2 solid rockets going off out of control, you know, this was like having a 100-pound sack of cement dropped in your lap suddenly. I didn't know what to say, but I knew I had to say something. All I could really do was to make a statement acknowledging that something was terribly wrong.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
The thing that I always think about is the reaction of the families of these astronauts who were at the launch site watching it and were hearing what I was saying because it's broadcast on loudspeakers.
It just didn't look right. And then Ed said, oh, she's gone. And I said, she's really gone. I don't see the shuttle. And it was something that everybody was looking at everybody else, not believing what they were seeing. And none of us wanted to accept what we were seeing. We knew something horrible was wrong.
Checking with the recovery forces.
Krista McAuliffe was everybody's school teacher. NASA had made a very big deal of it. We'd gone through the training with her. Children all across the country were watching that day in classrooms. And then to have it blow up the way that it did in front of Krista McAuliffe's parents and all the friends and family members who were there, that was a national trauma.
My 8-year-old mind, I was thinking, well, how do we fix it? How do we make it right? Are they going to parachute down? And I think from that moment on, I was about as mad at NASA as any little girl can be at anything.
One of my first expert astronauts working with me on the set during the early launches was Judy Resnick, who was unfortunately on board the Challenger. And we got to be pals.
Electrical engineer Dr. Judith Resnick was 36 years old. She did have a pretty good sense of humor. We used to have a little friendly bet from time to time about whether NASA could keep its launch schedule. And when I lost one, for a six-pack, quite honestly, I sent it to her at some expense, wrapped in a dozen long-stem roses. And she immediately sent back the message that she loved the beer, but the roses she didn't need necessarily.
I wanted to put it in some personal terms about who these people were that I knew. I didn't want to make myself a part of the story, but I thought that I owed it to Judith to do that.
Their spirit will live on. Their adventurous ways will be picked up and carried on by others. And the frontiers of space and knowledge will be expanded.
Come to the wall, and many of them have a prospect of war.
Tom Brokaw, Eyewitness to History, continues.
Tonight, from the Geneva Summit.
Good evening once again from Geneva, where President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev spent most of this day together.
The first time I saw Mikhail Gorbachev was in Geneva. When he stepped off the airplane, it took my breath away, because here was this very modern-looking man, and I thought, this is a different order of a Russian leader than we've been dealing with. And indeed he was. This was the man who had intrigued the West. Perestroika and glasnost were the new bywords of our time.
My father was waiting for a Soviet leader who was a modern man who he could deal with. And he found one in Gorbachev.
The first day we met during the first round of talks, Reagan called me a die-hard Bolshevik, and I called him a dinosaur. In spite of our critical attitude toward each other, I felt we could really do some business together.
I interpreted all those U.S.-Soviet summits, and all of them had difficult moments. But I must say that the greatest thing about Gorbachev and Reagan is that, unlike many of their predecessors, they kept at it.
NBC News presents.
In 1987, I went to Moscow, to the Kremlin, to interview Mikhail Gorbachev.
Here with the leader of the Soviet Union, NBC News correspondent Tom Brokaw.
General Secretary Gorbachev was already in place when I arrived for our interview in the capital.
No General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had ever been interviewed in a major way by a Western representative of the press.
We needed to change the nature of the relationship between the two superpowers. We had to talk to the United States.
Are you prepared now to reduce the number of men, tanks, and attack helicopters that you have in your...
We got all set to go, and I looked up, and he had a microphone on that looked like a Russian grenade from World War II that had been remade into a microphone. I reached across, and I started taking off that microphone and saying to my technician, get him a new microphone. And I suddenly realized he's looking at me, and we've just met, and I'm already playing with this tie. And I said to him, Mr. General Secretary, you have to understand, this is something I have to do in my job every day. And he said, you would not believe what I have to do in my job every day. Shortly after I interviewed Gorbachev, he came to Washington, and it was the beginning of a historic dialogue.
They're about to gather in the East Room of the White House to sign the INF Treaty for the elimination of medium-range nuclear missiles.
After decades and decades of this Cold War, it sort of evaporated.
We had so many weapon systems piled up that all hell could have broken loose even without a political decision. At the right time, when history was expecting us to act, President Reagan turned out to be the best partner.
Ronald Reagan was by far the largest figure on the Western side in terms of standing up to the Soviets.